The morning sun was already beating down on the city streets as Mr. Wilson wiped sweat from his forehead. He checked his watch, 9:17 a.m. Good, the bank had been open for 17 minutes, so the early morning rush would have died down. With an important check in his pocket, he quickened his pace. Mr. Wilson was proud of his work as a construction manager. After 15 years of climbing ladders, both real and figurative, he had built a solid reputation in the community. The check in his pocket represented the biggest project his small company had landed this year, a down payment for renovating the community center on the east side of town. The night before, he had told his wife about his plans. "First thing tomorrow, I'm taking this straight to the bank," he had said, waving the envelope with a grin. "Then it's off to the supply yard to get everything we need to start on Monday." His wife had smiled that proud smile he loved so much. "Just make sure you don't go to the bank in your work clothes like last time. Remember how the teller kept giving you funny looks with all that drywall dust in your hair?" But this morning, his youngest had missed the school bus, and after dropping the kid off, Mr. Wilson didn't have time to go back home and change. "It'll be fine," he thought, looking down at his clothes. His jeans were clean enough, and his boots only had a bit of mud from yesterday's site visit. The bright yellow safety vest was actually spotless. He'd just grabbed a fresh one from his truck. As he approached First National Bank, he could see a few customers through the glass doors. The security guard was standing just inside, nodding at people as they entered. Mr. Wilson straightened his back, reminded himself that his company's name was printed on the check. He belonged here just as much as anyone in a fancy suit. But when he reached for the door handle, the guard stepped forward, putting a hand up. "Sorry, sir. I can't let you in," the guard said, his voice formal but not unkind. Mr. Wilson stopped short, confused. "Excuse me." "Bank policy, sir. We can't allow people in with," the guard gestured vaguely at Mr. Wilson's chest, "with construction gear." The yellow vest, specifically. A woman in a business suit brushed past them, the guard nodding politely as she entered. Mr. Wilson felt his face grow warm as people began to stare. "I just need to make a deposit," Mr. Wilson explained, lowering his voice. "I'm not carrying any tools, it's just a vest." The guard shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. New policy as of last week. No high-visibility work gear inside the bank. You'll need to come back in different clothes." Mr. Wilson stood there, the important check feeling heavy in his pocket. He was already running late for a meeting with suppliers, and the bank branch near the supply yard wouldn't have his business account information. "Can I at least talk to someone about this? I've been banking here for years." "You can call the customer service line," the guard suggested, handing him a business card. "Or come back without the vest." People were definitely watching now. A few were whispering to each other, and Mr. Wilson caught a pitying glance from an elderly woman as she exited the bank. His cheeks burned with embarrassment. "Fine," he said finally, stepping back. "I'll come back another time." As he walked away, confusion gave way to frustration. Why would a safety vest be a problem? He'd come to this same bank covered in much more dirt before. Something didn't add up. Mr. Wilson got back into his truck, tossing the vest onto the passenger seat. He'd have to figure something out before his supplier's deadline at noon. As he started the engine, he decided to call his wife and tell her what happened. She always had a clearer head about these things. Little did he know that this small incident, this seemingly minor inconvenience on an otherwise ordinary morning, would snowball into something much bigger than a simple dress code dispute. Mr. Wilson sat in his truck for a few minutes, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. He dialed his wife's number, waiting as it rang 3 times before she picked up. "Hey, you won't believe what just happened," he said, still feeling the sting of embarrassment. He explained how the security guard had stopped him from entering the bank because of his yellow safety vest. "That's ridiculous," his wife said. "Since when do they care about work clothes? Half the town works construction or farming." "That's what I thought." Guard said it was some new policy. "I've got to figure out what to do with this check before meeting the suppliers." After hanging up, Mr. Wilson drove to the credit union across town. His company didn't have an account there, but they were able to cash the check for a small fee. Problem solved, at least for today. That evening, Mr. Wilson told the story again during dinner with his brother's family. His brother's teenage son perked up when he heard about the yellow vest. Wait, they wouldn't let you in because of your color? The nephew asked, already pulling out his phone. My vest color, Mr. Wilson clarified, the bright yellow safety vest. But his nephew was already typing something. People need to hear about this, that's not right. Mr. Wilson didn't think much about it until his phone started buzzing with notifications the next morning. His nephew had posted about the incident on social media, but somewhere in the retelling, an important detail had been lost. The post claimed that Mr. Wilson had been denied entry to First National Bank because of his color. Hundreds of people had shared the post overnight. Comments were flooding in, with many sharing their own stories of discrimination. Local community pages were lighting up with outrage. Someone had even created an event page for a protest outside the bank scheduled for the following day. This is getting out of hand, Mr. Wilson told his wife, scrolling through the comments. They think I wasn't allowed in because of who I am, not what I was wearing. You need to clear this up, she said, looking worried. He tried posting a clarification, explaining it was about his safety vest, but his comment was quickly buried under hundreds of angry responses. Some people even suggested he was backtracking under pressure from the bank. By lunchtime, local news outlets had picked up the story. DSCYMNATION at First National Bank, read one headline. Another site reported that sources close to the victim claimed the bank had a history of such incidents. Mr. Wilson's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Childhood friends he hadn't spoken to in years, distant relatives, even his old high school teacher called to offer support. Each time he tried to explain what really happened, but people seemed almost disappointed by the truth. Are you sure that's all it was? One friend pushed. You don't have to protect them. That afternoon, Mr. Wilson drove past the bank and was shocked to see a small group already gathered outside with signs. BNKNG for all, read one. Another said, We stand with Wilson. He parked across the street, watching with a growing knock in his stomach. This wasn't what he wanted. He wasn't looking for a movement or to be the face of some cause. He just wanted to deposit a check while wearing his work clothes. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. Channel 5 just called the house asking for an interview. The simple story had taken on a life of its own, spreading and changing like a game of telephone. What would happen when he showed up at the bank tomorrow in regular clothes and they let him right in? Would people believe him then? Or would they think he was being paid off to change his story? Mr. Wilson sighed deeply. He had a feeling this misunderstanding was just beginning to grow, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. Inside First National Bank, Mrs. Thompson stared at her computer screen in disbelief. As the branch manager for nearly 9 years, she dealt with plenty of customer complaints, but nothing like this. Her email inbox was overflowing with angry messages. The bank's social media pages were being flooded with negative comments, and someone had even created a 1-star review campaign against them. How did this happen? She asked, looking up at her assistant who stood nervously by the door. I've checked with all the security staff from Monday, the assistant replied. Ray was on door duty that morning. He says he did turn someone away, but it was because of our new safety policy about construction gear. Mrs. Thompson rubbed her temples. Just 3 weeks ago, their branch had been robbed by 2 men wearing construction vests and hard hats who blended in with a crew working across the street. Corporate security had issued a temporary policy requiring construction workers to remove high-visibility gear before entering. Signs had been posted, but they were small and easily missed. Pull the security footage, she said. I need to see exactly what happened. 20 minutes later, they watched the interaction between the security guard and Mr. Wilson. The footage had no audio, but it was clear the guard was pointing specifically at the yellow vest, not at Mr. Wilson himself. They could see several other customers entering at the same time, including people of various backgrounds who were admitted without question. This isn't about discrimination at all, Mrs. Thompson said with a sigh of relief. It's just the construction vest policy. Try telling that to the people outside, her assistant said, pointing toward the window where the small group of protesters from yesterday had now grown to about 30 people. Mrs. Thompson picked up the phone to call corporate headquarters. They needed to issue a statement quickly, but she also wanted to reach out to Mr. Wilson directly. The problem was, since he hadn't actually completed any transaction that day, they had no record of which customer he was or how to contact him. "We need to find this man before this gets any bigger," she told the corporate PR team. "Check our customer database for construction company owners or managers." By noon, the local news van had arrived outside the bank, and a reporter was interviewing protesters. Mrs. Thompson watched from her window as people shared impassioned stories about feeling unwelcome or discriminated against in businesses around town. The protest wasn't just about the bank anymore, it had tapped into deeper feelings in the community. One of the customer service representatives knocked on her door. "Mrs. Thompson, you might want to see this." He handed her his phone, showing a live stream from a local news station. The reporter was standing in front of their bank. Community members have gathered to protest what they describe as a pattern of discrimination at First National Bank, the reporter was saying. The incident involving local business owner Mr. Wilson has sparked outrage across social media platforms. "We reached out to Mr. Wilson for comment but haven't received a response." The camera panned to show the crowd, which had grown larger in just the past hour. Some protesters held signs with Mr. Wilson's name, others had more general messages about equality and respect. Mrs. Thompson's phone rang. Corporate was calling back. "We're drafting a statement," the PR director told her, "but without being able to name the customer or share security footage for privacy reasons, our hands are tied on how specific we can be." "So what do we say?" Mrs. Thompson asked. "We can explain the construction vest policy and the robbery that prompted it. We can categorically deny that any discrimination took place. But without the customer coming forward himself, this might not die down quickly." After hanging up, Mrs. Thompson stared out at the growing crowd. How had a simple dress code policy turned into this? Somewhere out there was Mr. Wilson, probably just as confused about how things had spiraled so far out of control. She hoped he would come forward soon. Until then, all she could do was try to protect her staff from the backlash and wait for the truth to emerge. Mr. Wilson spent most of Tuesday hiding out at his construction site, away from the growing chaos. His phone kept buzzing with notifications, but he'd stopped checking them after lunch. His crew noticed something was off. He wasn't his usual talkative self, barking orders without the friendly banter that normally made him such a good boss. "Everything okay?" his foreman asked during a coffee break. "You seem distracted." Mr. Wilson hesitated, then showed him the latest news article on his phone. The headline read, "Protest grows at First National Bank. Community demands accountability." "That's about you?" the foreman asked, eyes widening. "It's about something that never happened," Mr. Wilson sighed. "They wouldn't let me in because of my safety vest. That's it. Now everyone thinks it was something else." The foreman shook his head. "You need to clear this up. The longer it goes on, the harder it'll be to fix." Deep down, Mr. Wilson knew his friend was right. He'd been avoiding the situation, hoping it would blow over, but it was only getting bigger. By the time he drove home that evening, 3 news vans were parked on his street. Reporters called out to him as he hurried inside, locking the door behind him. His wife looked exhausted. "They've been calling all day," she said. "I stopped answering hours ago." Their kids were confused and upset. His teenage daughter showed him a text from her friend. "Is your dad really suing the bank?" His son mentioned that some kids at school were talking about going to the protest tomorrow. "This has to stop," Mr. Wilson said, making a decision. "I'm going to that bank tomorrow morning and sorting this out in person." His wife looked worried. "With all those protesters there? What if they don't believe you?" It was a fair question. He'd already tried posting online, but his explanations were either ignored or, worse, interpreted as him being pressured to backtrack. Some comments suggested the bank was threatening his business loans if he didn't change his story. "I have to try," he said. "The truth has to matter more than a good story." That night, he barely slept. What would he say? Would anyone listen? The situation had taken on a life of its own, growing far beyond the simple misunderstanding at its core. Meanwhile, across town, Mrs. Thompson wasn't sleeping either. She'd spent the evening in emergency meetings with the bank's regional director and legal team. They drafted a statement explaining the construction gear policy and denying any discrimination, but the PR team warned it might look defensive without Mr. Wilson's support. We've tried finding contact information for all our customers who own construction businesses, Mrs. Thompson told them. But without knowing exactly who we're looking for, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. What about the security guard who turned him away? The legal advisor asked. Ray feels terrible about all this. He was just following the new policy. He specifically remembers telling the man it was because of the yellow vest. The regional director looked grim. The protest organizers are saying they expect hundreds tomorrow. We're going to close the branch for safety reasons, but that will only feed into their narrative that we're avoiding accountability. Mrs. Thompson stared at the security footage still framed showing Mr. Wilson standing at the bank door, yellow vest bright against his work clothes. If only she could find him, talk to him directly. There had to be a way to fix this before it damaged the bank's reputation permanently, and before Mr. Wilson became defined by an incident that never actually happened. As Wednesday morning dawned, both Mr. Wilson and Mrs. Thompson prepared for what would likely be one of the most difficult days of their professional lives. Neither knew they were about to finally meet face to face, or that their conversation would take an unexpected turn that no one could have predicted. Wednesday morning greeted the town with a surprisingly bright sky after days of cloudy weather. Mr. Wilson dressed carefully, plain blue button-up shirt, khaki pants, no work boots, and definitely no yellow vest. He wanted nothing to distract from what he had to say. "You sure about this?" his wife asked, handing him a travel mug of coffee. "No," he admitted, "but it has to be done." As he drove downtown, his stomach tightened at the sight ahead. The crowd outside First National Bank had grown to over 100 people. Some carried signs with his name, others chanted slogans about equality. A makeshift podium had been set up, where a local community organizer was speaking into a microphone. News vans lined the street, reporters doing live broadcasts from the sidewalk. "What have I walked into?" Mr. Wilson whispered to himself as he parked a block away. He took a deep breath and walked toward the bank. Nobody recognized him at first. He was just another face in the growing crowd. He overheard snippets of conversation, people discussing poor Mr. Wilson and how the bank had shown its true colors. It felt strange, hearing strangers talk about him while standing right beside them. The community organizer was mid-speech. "And we won't stop until First National acknowledges its biased practices and makes real changes. Mr. Wilson deserves justice." The crowd cheered. Mr. Wilson winced. Inside the bank, which was closed to customers but staffed with essential personnel, Mrs. Thompson watched the protest through the blinds. Security guards stood by the doors, instructed to be polite but firm. No one was entering today except employees. Her assistant rushed in. "Someone saying he's Mr. Wilson just called the customer service line. He's here outside and wants to come in to speak with management." Mrs. Thompson's heart raced. "Let him in through the side door," quietly. Meanwhile, Mr. Wilson had worked his way to the front of the crowd. He stood there for a moment, watching the speaker, gathering his courage. When the man paused for breath, Mr. Wilson raised his hand. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice not as strong as he'd hoped. Few people noticed him. He tried again louder. "Excuse me. I'm Mr. Wilson." Like a wave, silence spread through the crowd as people turned to look at him. The community organizer squinted from the podium. "Mr. Wilson? The Mr. Wilson?" he asked, gesturing for someone to bring a microphone over. "Please, come up and share your experience." The crowd parted, and suddenly all eyes were on him. Camera crews swung their equipment in his direction. Mr. Wilson hadn't planned on speaking to the entire crowd. He just wanted to go inside and clear things up with the bank manager. But now, with everyone watching expectantly, he realized this might be his only chance to set the record straight. As he reluctantly approached the podium, a bank security guard appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Wilson," the guard asked quietly, "Mrs. Thompson would like to speak with you inside, if you're willing." Mr. Wilson glanced between the guard and the waiting crowd. The community organizer was already announcing to everyone that the victim himself was about to speak. "I need to tell them the truth first," Mr. Wilson told the guard. "Then I'll come inside." He stepped up to the microphone, hands slightly shaking. The crowd fell completely silent, phones raised to record his every word. News cameras zoomed in on his face. Whatever he said next would be all over social media within minutes. "My name is Mr. Wilson," he began, voice steadier than he felt. "And I think there's been a big misunderstanding." Some confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the angry testimony they'd been expecting. "I was turned away from this bank on Monday morning," he continued, "but it wasn't because of who I am. It was because of what I was wearing. A bright yellow construction safety vest." The crowd's reaction was a mix of confusion and disbelief. Some people frowned, others whispered to their neighbors. No one quite knew how to respond to this unexpected twist in the story they thought they knew. The crowd stood in stunned silence for several long seconds. Mr. Wilson gripped the microphone, waiting for someone to say something, anything. Finally, a voice from the back called out, "They got to you, didn't they? The bank threatened your loans." Several people nodded in agreement. Mr. Wilson shook his head. "No, nobody got to me. This is what happened from the beginning," he insisted. "I tried to explain online, but nobody listened." The community organizer stepped forward, gently taking the microphone. "Mr. Wilson, you don't have to protect the bank. We're here to support you." "But that's just it," Mr. Wilson said, raising his voice to be heard without the microphone. "I don't need support for something that never happened." He pulled out his phone and opened his photos. "Look, I even have a picture of what I was wearing that day." He held up the screen showing a selfie he'd taken at a job site Monday morning, bright yellow vest clearly visible. The security guard pointed at this vest, not at me. "There was a robbery here recently where the robbers wore construction gear as a disguise." Confusion spread through the crowd. Some people began to drift away, embarrassed. Others pressed closer, still suspicious. One woman in the front row crossed her arms. "So why didn't the bank just say that?" she demanded. "They did," Mr. Wilson said. "They posted about their new policy, but the signs were small. And they released a statement yesterday explaining it was about work gear. But by then, everyone was already convinced they were covering something up." The news reporters pushed forward, sensing that the story had just taken an unexpected turn. "Mr. Wilson, are you saying there was no discrimination at all?" one asked, thrusting a microphone toward him. "That's exactly what I'm saying," he replied. "This whole thing started because my nephew misunderstood what I told him about being turned away because of my color. He thought I meant, well, you know what he thought. But I meant the color of my vest. By the time I realized what was happening, the story had already spread too far." The community organizer looked stunned. "You're sure about this?" "Absolutely sure." "I've been in construction for 15 years, Mr. Wilson said. "I know what it's like to be judged unfairly. If that had happened here, I'd be the first one with a sign in my hand. But that's not what this was." As Mr. Wilson spoke, the bank's side door opened. Mrs. Thompson stepped out, flanked by two other bank employees. The crowd tensed, some people booing. "May I say something?" Mrs. Thompson asked, approaching slowly. Mr. Wilson nodded and handed her the microphone. She looked nervous but determined. "First, I want to thank Mr. Wilson for coming forward with the truth," she began. "We've been trying to explain that this was about our temporary security policy, not discrimination. After a robbery last month where the criminals wore construction vests, our corporate office implemented new security guidelines." She held up a laminated card with security protocols listed. All branches were instructed to turn away anyone in high-visibility construction gear unless they removed it first. We should have posted larger signs. We should have explained it better. That's on us, and I apologize for the confusion it caused. Mr. Wilson nodded in agreement. "I'm not happy about being turned away that day, but I understand why it happened now. Maybe the policy could have been handled better, but it wasn't what everyone thought." The crowd began to break up, some people looking disappointed, others embarrassed. The news reporters were already crafting their updated headlines: "Bank protest based on misunderstanding," and "Construction vest, not discrimination, at heart of bank controversy." Mr. Wilson felt a weight lifting from his shoulders as Mrs. Thompson approached him directly. "Would you be willing to come inside and talk?" she asked quietly. "I think we both have some ideas about how to prevent this kind of misunderstanding in the future." He glanced at the dispersing crowd, then back at the bank manager. "Yeah," he said, "I think that's a conversation worth having." As they walked toward the bank's side entrance, Mr. Wilson realized that sometimes clearing up a misunderstanding wasn't the end of the story. Sometimes it was just the beginning of something better. 1 month later, Mr. Wilson stood in front of First National Bank, but this time there were no protesters, no news vans, and no security guards blocking his way. Instead, a small group of people had gathered for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. A large banner hung above the entrance. "Community Banking Day, everyone welcome." "Ready?" Mrs. Thompson asked, handing him a large pair of scissors. Mr. Wilson nodded, a little embarrassed by all the attention. "Still think you should be doing this, not me." "Nonsense," she replied. "This was your idea." In the weeks following the protest, Mr. Wilson and Mrs. Thompson had met several times to discuss how the bank could better serve the community. What started as an awkward conversation about misunderstandings had evolved into a genuine friendship and partnership. The bank had made several changes. The tiny signs about the construction gear policy had been replaced with clear, friendly notices explaining the security concern and offering customers a place to store work gear while banking. They'd extended their hours on Fridays to accommodate people who worked construction jobs. And most importantly, they'd created a community advisory board to help guide bank policies, with Mr. Wilson as its first chairperson. "I never wanted to be in the spotlight," Mr. Wilson had told his wife the night before. "But if this helps make sure others don't face the same confusion, it's worth it." As the small crowd applauded, Mr. Wilson cut the ribbon. People filed into the bank for the open house event, where free coffee and donuts waited. Local business owners had set up small tables to showcase their services, including Mr. Wilson's construction company. His nephew approached, looking sheepish. "Uncle, I'm still really sorry about what happened." Mr. Wilson put his arm around the young man's shoulders. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is what we learn from them." The boy had learned a tough lesson about social media and the responsibility that came with sharing stories online. He'd posted a public apology that went almost as viral as his original misrepresentation, and he'd spent weekends volunteering at community events as a way to make amends. Inside the bank, Mrs. Thompson gave a short speech about the importance of clear communication and community involvement. She didn't mention the protest directly. Everyone knew that story already, but instead focused on the positive changes that had emerged from it. "Sometimes misunderstandings can lead to better understanding," she said, "if we're willing to listen to each other." Mr. Wilson's crew had come to support him, all of them dressed in their work clothes, but with their yellow vests respectfully removed inside the bank. They teased him about becoming a fancy businessman now that he served on a bank committee. "Don't worry," he assured them. "I'm still more comfortable on a construction site than in a boardroom." The local newspaper ran a small article about the event. The headline read, "From Misunderstanding to Understanding. Local bank and business owner create community partnership." It wasn't as exciting as the headlines from a month ago, but Mr. Wilson preferred it that way. As the event wound down, Mr. Wilson found a quiet moment to slip away and complete the transaction he'd originally come to do that Monday morning. Though, of course, he'd since deposited the check elsewhere. He approached a teller window and pulled out a small check. "Just opening a savings account for my youngest," he explained. "Figure it's never too early to learn about banking." The teller smiled. "Absolutely right, Mr. Wilson, and your children get our special Junior Saver rate." As he completed the paperwork, Mr. Wilson reflected on how differently things had turned out from what anyone could have expected. A simple misunderstanding about a yellow vest had led to community-wide conversations about inclusion, communication, and trust. The bank had improved its policies. He'd made new friends and connections. His construction business had even picked up a few new clients. Sometimes, he thought, life's most important lessons come from the strangest situations. The trick was being willing to listen, learn, and grow together as a community. "All set, Mr. Wilson," the teller said, handing him a receipt. "Anything else we can help you with today?" "No thanks," he smiled. "Everything's exactly as it should be."